Okay. Well, today we have Miriam Jones coming to us from USGS. Her background is in paleoecology and doing work relevant for permafrost and carbon as well. For those keeping score, this relates to research objectives 6.1 and 6.2 with the permafrost chapter in the current Arctic Research Plan. Miriam did her dissertation at Columbia and went on to postdoc with Katie Walter Anthony, and is currently at USGS in Reston, Virginia. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Miriam.
Okay, thanks so much for having me and for inviting me to give this talk. I am going to cover a lot of different topics related to how permafrost dynamics have changed over the Holocene. And so the Holocene refers to the last roughly 11,500 years. So basically the warm interglacial we're in now, coming out of the last glacial maximum. So just, you guys probably all know this, but there's a lot of carbon in permafrost soils. And so what is the history of the, both how it got there, when it got there, when the permafrost aggraded, and what's happening with permafrost thaw. So we all know that the climate is warming rapidly in the high latitudes, and especially at the southern margins of permafrost, there's very rapid changes occurring with the thawing of permafrost. And so we all want to know what happens to these carbon-rich soils when the permafrost thaws. So this is actually something Ben Jones worked on, but one of the sites we are currently working on is on the Kenai Peninsula, which is in the very southern margins of permafrost extent. And so Ben found that in these permafrost sites, about 60% of it has been lost since 1950. And so we're trying to currently figure out, using plant macrofossils and oxygen isotopes in peat, when the permafrost aggraded and what that means for the climate of permafrost aggradation. I'm not going to show any data specifically from this site, but I will say that preliminary results suggest that permafrost aggraded during what we call the neoglaciation, which is roughly as climate cooled during the Holocene about 3,000 years ago. It looks like a lot of the permafrost that exists today formed then and sort of gradually expanded throughout the Little Ice Age, which just happened a few hundred years ago. And so this permafrost is very warm. We were actually just up there a couple weeks ago, and I think Ben said that he recorded permafrost temperatures around 0 degrees. So it's very, very close to thawing. So there's been estimates to suggest that all sporadic and discontinuous permafrost will disappear by 2100 with the projected high latitude warming. There's about 85 petagrams of carbon in peat soils in this sporadic and discontinuous permafrost zone. So we want to know what happens when this permafrost thaws. This is sort of taken from another presentation. It's just a little more background, and it shows different forms of permafrost thaw. So you can have methane being released from thawing lakes, which, if you know Katie Walter's work, then you know all about this. There's also permafrost thaw on continental margins, and so you have a lot of terrestrial permafrost carbon ending up in the oceans. You can see that in this lower image, sort of all the sediment ending up in the ocean. And then this bottom right image is from the Onoko National Wildlife Refuge, and it shows these forested permafrost plateaus thawing and becoming these really wet collapsed scar bogs. And so the figure on the right is just for those of you that don't really normally think about paleoclimate and the long-term history of permafrost in relation to past climate change. this record here shows age on the x-axis, so 20,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago. And this period of time experienced very rapid climate warming. Most strikingly at around 14.7 thousand years ago, there was a very quick warming coming out of the last glacial maximum called the Bowling-Allerud warming. Can you guys see my cursor when I'm pointing to the image? Okay. So the curve that I'm pointing to now, this is atmospheric methane concentrations, which were collected from ice cores. And you can see that there's a gradually increase in the atmospheric methane concentration, and then it increases incredibly rapidly at this 14.7 thousand years ago time interval, or 14.6. And so a lot of what my research has focused on in recent years is what is the source of this atmospheric methane increase. It's been attributed to wetlands and also permafrost. And so what we've been trying to do is figure out how much of that can be related to permafrost. And this study that came out a couple of years ago showed that the amount of radiocarbon in the atmosphere changed in such a way to suggest that that part of this can be attributed to permafrost thaw during that time period. And so when I worked with Katie, one of the things we worked on is looking at not only the release of methane from thermokarst lakes. So this upper curve here is that same time period. The axis is now reversed. 20,000 years ago is on the right, present day is on the left. And during that warm Bowling-Allerud period, there was an increase in new thermokarst lake formation, and then it declined during this cold snap called the Younger Dryas cold interval. And then this is the early Holocene warming. This curve above that is the solar insolation. So solar insolation increased during this early Holocene period. So the growing season became longer. There was more radiation reaching the northern high latitudes during this time. And so the net effect was that it was warmer. And there's other evidence to suggest that, for example, Alaska was a lot warmer then than it is today. There were trees growing on the North Slope during that time period, just as an example. And you can also see that there was a lot of thermokarst lake activity during that time, so new lakes forming during that early Holocene period. So we did a modeling exercise to not only look at the amount of methane being released from these lakes, but also the net carbon uptake in lake sediments over that time period. And what we found is that when you look at the net effect of CO2 and methane, both release and uptake, that eventually you end up below this zero line, meaning there's a net uptake. And that happened about mid-Holocene time period. So about 5,000 years ago, thermokarst lakes became a net had a net cooling effect in terms of their radiative forcing. And on the right is a previous study that I worked on the Northern Seward Peninsula that sort of showed the same thing. What we did is we quantified the amount of carbon in these drained thermokarst lake basins. So these thermokarst lakes are somewhat ephemeral on longer timescales on the landscape. So they exist for an average of about 3,000 years. And so eventually then they drain and then they fill with peat. And so that's what we're showing here, that the amount of peat increases. So we classified them into different age classes. And so the carbon accumulation rates are fastest when they're newly drained, and then they slowly decline. But the amount of peat carbon increases with time, with age class. So then one of the conundrums with looking at these reconciling the atmospheric record versus what we're seeing from these bottom-up measurements is that they don't always agree. So on the right here, again, is a study from Katie Walter Anthony's work that showed that the amount of soil organic carbon erosion is directly proportional to the amount of ebullition of methane coming out of lakes. And that also the soil organic carbon age can be related back to the bubble age of methane. And so that is a clear indication that this carbon, this old carbon, is ending up in the atmosphere. However, when we take a much larger scale look at what's happening on the North Slope, there's not a appreciable relationship between or increase in the amount of carbon being released to the atmosphere over that time period. So on the right here, you see temperatures increasing, but there's not a huge increase in the amount of methane released with time. So part of that is likely the result of these very complex landscapes where you have some lakes that are and collapse scar features that are releasing carbon to the atmosphere, but then you also have other places where you have an uptake of carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. So it's not very straightforward. So now I'm going to talk about a study that I published last year from 2 sites and that looked at the amount of carbon loss from permafrost peatlands following thaw. So this is from the Anoco National Wildlife Refuge and the Koyukuk National Wildlife Refuge. And this region is experiencing very rapid permafrost thaw. So it's sort of in interior Western Alaska. We're also working in, the Bonanza Creek LTER site, but those data have not yet been published. So just to give you an idea of what these landscapes look like, there's permafrost plateaus that are dry enough to support boreal forest trees and lichens in the understory. And then in between, you have these collapse scar features, which are very wet. Sometimes they form lakes if they are very ice rich, or you have these collapse scar bogs that form from the ground. This is what it looks like. You can see the amount of subsidence that happens between this permafrost plateau and this collapse scar bog feature. And so what we did in this study is we took a chronosequence approach to quantify the amount of carbon loss in these systems. So we took a number of cores from frozen permafrost peat plateaus, and then we took cores from a suite of collapse scar features ranging in age from 10 years ago that the thaw feature began to older features that were about 500 to even 1,000 years old, and looked at the amount of carbon in these different stocks. So the post-thaw stocks versus the silvic or woody permafrost peat plateau stocks. And what we found is that there was very rapid loss of carbon following thaw. So this is carbon stocks on the y-axis and age, years since thaw, on the x-axis. And so you can see there's sort of this this exponential decline in carbon stocks from when it was a frozen plateau, and then it eventually gets to a point where it doesn't lose more carbon, but it's already lost quite a bit. So we found that it loses about 30% of its carbon in these different landscapes. And to get a better handle on the control and the timing of this, we modeled it. So this is just the setup of our very simple mass balance model. And so we used 5 different initiation times. So this is peat initiation on the landscape, and then 5 different times of thaw. And what we found is that so these are all the different runs here. So the uppermost is the oldest site, and then the lowermost is the youngest site. And so these are pictures from thaws that happened 1,500 years ago. And what you can see is that they all lost, and the way this model is set up, lost about 30% of their carbon. The site that was 10,000 years ago, because it's a of its initial carbon stock, never actually recuperated all of its former carbon stocks. But the younger sites that had significantly less carbon to begin with actually gained a lot of carbon back. So basically that's saying that after a site thaws, there's collapsed scar bog peat that forms on top of it. So that is accumulating, but then you have this former permafrost plateau peat underneath it that thaws, and then that carbon is lost from that deeper stock. So you're losing from that deeper stock, but then you're gaining from the upper collapsed scar bog feature. And so this is that initial formerly frozen permafrost peat stock that's lost, and then eventually that collapsed scar bog peat takes over. So if you look at a thaw that happened 100 years ago, for example, none of the sites have recuperated all of the carbon that they initially had prior to thaw. So then we did, we looked at the net flux of carbon to the atmosphere. That's just taking the net carbon loss at each time step minus the net carbon gain at each time step. And we found that no site was a net source to the atmosphere for longer than 50 years following thaw. And the ones that had the most carbon flux were the oldest bog sites. So if we kind of scale this up and look at the amount of carbon that's in all discontinuous and sporadic permafrost, it results in a net loss of carbon to the atmosphere of about 56 petagrams. If all of the sites behave the way these two sites did. And the one thing I didn't say about the two sites that we studied is that they formed permafrost syngenetically, so they were minimally decomposed prior to permafrost thaw. And we think that might make a difference. Some of our preliminary analysis from the Bonanza Creek LTER suggests that there's not as much carbon loss because those sites are epigenetic, so they formed permafrost in the Little Ice Age after there was already a significant amount of peat accumulation. So that permafrost carbon is potentially less labile than the carbon from peat that formed syngenetically that was more minimally decomposed, if that makes sense. It's a mouthful. So then another study that I worked on is trying to evaluate in permafrost peatlands from across the, sorry, my phone is ringing. From across the landscape, we looked at when permafrost aggraded in these peatlands and when they thawed. So we took all available peat core records from the circumboreal. So I did this work with Claire Treat, who was a postdoc with me for a couple of years here in Reston. And so basically we analyzed all peatlands within the last glacial maximum permafrost zone. And so the implication there is that the permafrost extended farther south during the last glacial maximum, and it's gradually been increasing northward throughout the Holocene. And so we looked at these different macrofossil records from these peat cores, and we classified them based on their vegetation, so their whether they were bogs or fens or had evidence of permafrost. So, and that includes peat plateaus, palzas, bogs, and fens with permafrost, polygonal peat plateaus, high and low center polygons, and tundra with more than 30 centimeters of organic soils. And then we also looked at evidence for features of thermokarst, which includes collapsed scar fens, bogs, and thaw ponds. And then we also looked at at cores or parts of cores that had an other category, which is that they were classified as marshy swamps, peatland pools, etc. So this is just a map showing the locations, and the white squares are the sites that don't have any permafrost recorded in them. And then the different colors show the different time periods in which permafrost aggraded. So as you can see, generally farther north, permafrost aggraded a lot earlier than farther south. And so this is just a summary figure. And this paper is in review in the Holocene right now, so hopefully it'll get accepted. But so the upper panel here is temperature in Greenland, which is basically the oxygen isotope record. And then these are the different categories of peatland types. So fens, bogs, permafrost, cores that have thaw, and this is just to account for how many new records appear in each time step. And so this is 6,000 years ago to present. And what you can see is that there's kind of a gradual increase in the number of bogs because just autogenic peatland dynamics suggests that fens eventually accumulate peat above the water table and therefore then switch to bogs. So bogs are fed by precipitation only, whereas fens are fed by groundwater. And then similarly, as they switch to bogs, there's also an increase in the amount of permafrost in the late Holocene. So this kind of shows it, a little more roughly. So this is 4,000 years ago to present. And what you can see is that basically we're currently at, or at least our pre-industrial, we're at our maximum extent of permafrost in these peatlands. And there's a big uptick in the amount of permafrost about 1,000 years ago, and then again, another one about 300 to 400 years ago. So this would be the Little Ice Age increase in permafrost. So when conditions got significantly cooler during the Little Ice Age. And then we broke it down by region. So Eastern North America, and then the number of cores during each, and included in each region. Central North America, Canadian Arctic, in Alaska, and British Columbia. And what you can see is that generally there's a pretty big increase in the rate of permafrost aggradation. Permafrost here is in blue, about 3,000 years ago. In the Canadian Arctic, it happened earlier, but that makes sense because it's generally a lot colder up there. And then it happened a little bit later in Central North America. So there are spatial trends to the timing of permafrost aggradation in the Holocene. And so this is stepping over to Europe. So this is Arctic Europe, European Russia, and the Russian coastal plain, Fennoscandia, Western and Central Siberia, and Eastern Siberia. And they generally show the same thing, an increase around 3,000 years ago in the rate of permafrost aggradation. And in some places, it happens around 1,000 years ago. And that's tied mostly to insulation-driven climatic cooling that happened. There's a large uptick in the amount of sea ice in the Arctic in the last 3,000 years compared to previously in the Holocene. So that's also related to sort of increasing the continentality on a lot of these terrestrial landscapes as well. And then this isn't really my research, so I'm not really going to present this, but I've been working with Mark Waldrop, and this is from the Bonanza Creek LTER site. And so we've been trying to get at this question of how we can account for the amount of carbon loss observed from these carbon stock measurements from cores to the fluxes that he can measure. So he's doing a lot of work with actually physically measuring the fluxes, and then also doing incubations and things with microbial communities, and looking at water chemistry, the isotopes of methane and CO2. And just briefly going back to the study from the Onoko and Koyukuk site, he did find that the warmest peats, or the warmest temperatures in the peat occurred in the youngest bogs, which agrees sort of with our analysis of when we think the most carbon is lost in those really young sites. So warmer would suggest increased microbial activity and increased carbon loss. And similarly, he broke down the production potential in the sylvic versus sphagnic peats. So the formerly frozen permafrost plateau versus the new collapsed scar bog peat accumulation, and found that the highest methane production potential was from the really young bogs. And this is also just to show something similar, that they had the highest amount of dissolved organic carbon were in these really young bogs. So that's still work in progress, and we're just trying to kind of close the accounting of these bottom-up carbon stock losses from that we observe in the cores versus the losses of carbon from different aged thermokarst bogs. And what he's found is that winter fluxes are incredibly important, and so they can't be left out of the equation. But this measured flux only accounts for about 15% of the carbon stock losses that we observe in our core stock analyses. And I guess I'll leave it there. I'll let you guys read these conclusions. There's still a lot of uncertainty in what we need to learn about carbon dynamics in these systems, but I think we're getting closer, and I think a lot of it is related to the complexity, both spatially and temporally, of these landscapes.
Thanks, Miriam. That was a great talk, and I suspect you're going to get a bunch of questions right now. So yeah, we'd like to open it up for questions, and anyone who wants to get started, please fire away.
Hi, Miriam. Thank you for that presentation. It was really great. The previous slide, I think you said that only 30% of the carbon is also the carbon loss is measured with the carbon stock method. Is that right?
Yes.
Where do you think that the rest of the carbon is going?
So when we were out in the field a couple of weeks ago on the Kenai Peninsula, one thing we discussed is we've been measuring these carbon stock losses from features where permafrost has already completely thawed. So what we're not accounting for yet is on the permafrost plateaus themselves, there's a lot of variation in the active layer depth. And so we determined that like our reference permafrost location has an active layer of about 40 centimeters, but all around it, like for example, where there was an opening in the tree canopy, the active layer was upwards of 1 meter to 1.5 meters. And so potentially when there's still permafrost, but the active layer is just a lot deeper, it's possible that that might be a place we need to start looking that it's being lost as the active layer is deepening.
Have you looked at lateral losses at all?
We have not, no. I mean, I think in general, these these collapse scar features that we've been looking at is they're still surrounded completely by permafrost. So there's permafrost in a ring all the way around them. And the conductivity is so low in these systems because they're so saturated that I think that there's not a lot of outflow, but I could be wrong.
So one thing I'm curious about is that a number of the points you discussed seem to fit really well into the idea that Merritt Turetsky and Dave McGuire and some other folks were talking about sort of a bookkeeping method of accounting for carbon throughout the Arctic. And I'm wondering the degree to which you're active in that effort, or if you know anything about how far along that is at this point.
Yeah, I am working on the lowland component with Merritt in terms of their bookkeeping method. And their method is a little bit different, but we're seeing similar things. And we're trying to add a few more sites. The sites that we've worked on, as I mentioned, the Koyukuk and Onoko sites had syngenetic permafrost. So like when you looked at these permafrost cores, even the peat that was 6,000 years old looked perfectly preserved. And so what we're seeing at our Bonanza Creek LTER site is even in the permafrost plateaus, the peat is fairly decomposed already. And so I think the amount of carbon loss in these locations where permafrost didn't degrade until the Little Ice Age, that permafrost loss is going to be less. And that kind of is in agreement with one of the sites that David Olefelt and his students have worked on in the Northwest Territories, showing that there's less carbon loss there than the sites that we've worked on. Okay,
great. Another thing I was kind of curious about is early on you mentioned that there was something like a 60% loss, and this was based on the work down on the Kenai, and I'm wondering if that, since 1950, and I'm wondering how far that number may extrapolate. Is that just the Kenai, the sporadic permafrost zone? Do you have a sense of how applicable that is?
Yeah, so that was, Ben might be able to answer that question a little bit better. So he basically just looked at repeat aerial imagery of very specific localized sites on the Kenai and sort of trace the outline of where permafrost was in 1950 versus where it is today. And so from those images, about 60% less permafrost existed today compared to then. And these, I mean, so it was kind of actually surprising to find permafrost on the Kenai Peninsula to begin with, because it is warm down there. I think the mean annual air temperatures might even be something like 2 degrees Celsius. So they're definitely above where you would typically find permafrost. So it's definitely ecosystem protected from permafrost. And so what we're trying to figure out is this a relic from the last glacial maximum, or did it degrade more recently in the Holocene? And so it just looks like, because there's such rapid warming now, that this sort of relict permafrost is now rapidly thawing.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of the information you presented was really informative. It still strikes me, that figure you had early on that showed at the Bullring Allerid the immediate spike, and then again, I'm not sure you mentioned it specifically, but you could see this just immediate drop in the younger Dryas, and then it flipped back on again. It was like flipping a switch.
Yeah.
And I don't think I ever appreciated how immediate the effects are.
Yeah, and that's still like a huge issue of discussion in both the paleoclimate and anyone studying the carbon cycle, because it is really dramatic, this really rapid increase. And then you're right, like, so this was a period where it was a lot colder, and then it got significantly warmer all of a sudden over a matter of decades. And so you can see that whatever is causing that is very responsive to atmospheric temperatures at that time. And there's been a lot of work to try to narrow down the sources of the methane, and through isotopic analysis, they've basically determined that it is a wetland source primarily, mostly. So whether that's including permafrost in that wetland source. So we know that tropical wetlands were expanding during that time period, so it's not all high latitude, but it's really hard to imagine a place that would have produced that much increase in atmospheric methane so suddenly. One of the other hypotheses is that that there was a basically destabilization of clathrates because sea level was increasing so rapidly during that time period. But that's been mostly discounted now because the deuterium isotopes just don't agree with that being a primary source. But it could have been something like, for example, when the ice sheets were pulling away, that that there was some carbon cap that was underneath this ice sheet that then was released to the atmosphere. And that when the younger dryas happened, glaciers started expanding again. And so that could have been an explanation.
Yeah, this stuff's fascinating. Well, I don't want to start dominating the Q&A session. Are there any other questions people would like to put forward?
Yeah, I have a question. It's Vladimir. And my question about aggradation, so growing new permafrost, that's what you showed in the second part of your presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like all your places and areas you did research showing continued aggradation of permafrost, even on the time scale of, see the last, well, those ones pretty, yeah. So like, let's see, yeah, it's pretty, of course, very, yeah, it's thousands of years. But at some point, I think maybe in the previous one, in the previous slide.
This one?
Yeah, yeah, that's better. So you see this, well, I don't know what is minus 100 on the time age scale.
Oh, yeah,
is it future?
No, so that has to do with radiocarbon dating is.
Okay, anyway, so we are talking now already 100 years time scale, and you still see aggradation of development of new permafrost even during the last, say, 150 years after Little Ice Age, which, well, all records of climate showing that there's definitely increase in air temperature. So
Yeah.
what other factors, what other components of the system make permafrost aggrading still even with when climate is warming, getting warmer?
Yeah, you know, this is actually a very preliminary figure, and maybe I shouldn't have thrown this on. The only reason I put this on is that it does show this big increase about 1,000 years ago, and then again during the Little Ice Age. So I haven't looked at the data to see exactly what that can be attributed to. There were new sites, so younger sites that came online as we did this analysis. And so this is area. So I would need to look back at the data. I'm not exactly sure. I think these are probably a little bit more realistic.
Yeah, well, on this time scale, of course, very difficult to say what's going on during the last 100 years. But also, I would say you probably have to be also taking into account some, especially if you're dealing with some boreal forest areas, that aggradation of permafrost could happen after fire. So you have to look at, I mean, you can formally see aggradation forming of new permafrost in the places where it was destroyed by fire, but not because of climate change, but because of these disturbances.
Yeah, so we talk a little bit about local versus regional effects in this paper, and because this is a summation of many cores over this time period, what we are suggesting is instead of looking at each individual core and trying to attribute, what caused permafrost to degrade at that site, we're taking the sum of all these cores together and looking at time periods when there are major increases in the amount of permafrost aggradation. So when you see this large increase in aggradation, for example, during this time period, it suggests that that was some regional scale climatic cooling that happened. Or,
yeah, well, on this time scale, of course, yeah, it's little ice age. It's understandable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, there's a lot of localized effects and non-climate effects that can cause both aggradation and degradation. That's definitely true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course in the colder present-day colder conditions, drainage of lakes will definitely result in aggradation of permafrost.
Yeah, and actually, that's probably what this is, because we did include the sites from the northern Seward Peninsula that I studied that were from these drained thermokarst lake basins. So,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that may be explanation for that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else?
Oh, going once. Going
Well, I can probably just, we still have time, right?
Oh yeah, we do.
Yeah, this kind of degradation of permafrost in the way to turning from peat plateau into bogs. It's one of the way of, and it's actually the most common right now, degradation of permafrost. And in the future with warmer climate, it will be maybe a little bit different, but now it's the most common. So in some way, it's like lakeshore erosion. If you have lake already, it's really doesn't, well, there is some effect of climate, of course, but much less. The presence of lake itself will make the lakeshore thaw, and you'll have permafrost degradation even with warmer climate. I mean, cooling climate. So when you have already the feature, it lives on their own, and not necessarily you will find very good correlation with some climate variations on the scale of decadal or even century timescales. The same is bogs. So if bog is already there, so it will, no matter what, of course, if it will go back to new ice age, of course, this process will stop. But within a couple degrees Celsius in air temperature, this bog will still continue move into the plateau. I mean, plateau will be degrading, maybe with different rate, maybe with higher temperature, warmer climate, the rate will be higher, but it will be. What is really interesting to look at, and you mentioned already, and also it's interesting in terms of carbon release, is the formation of new, well, not bogs yet, but some thermokarst depressions, which eventually will turn into bogs. And that's a completely different story here, because that could happen only with or warmer climate or maybe higher precipitation, or something should happen. Otherwise, it will not happen at all. Though, while the extension of bogs will be happening anyway. So I think this kind of distinguishing between new forms forming and kind of routine extent of bogs will make your study even more interesting, because you may look differently and if you, of course, if you have enough data, you can analyze differently, kind of routine extent of existing bogs and forming new depressions, new thermokarst depression, forming new bogs. That will give you even, I think, more interesting results, because you will see a big difference of behavior of these things, especially in relation to climate. And of course, as results will be also different, and you already mentioned it. So the most release or whatever mobilization of carbon is related to new forms developing, not kind of old routines.
Yeah, so we thought we were going early enough when we were looking at these tiny little thermokarst depressions, young bogs, but I think we got to go even where there's just active layer thickening in this frozen peat plateau.
Yeah, and of course, hopefully we will live to the point when it will be not just bogs form of degradation from frost, but it will be widespread degradation when this active layer will start to freeze. And maybe when you're mentioning this 1.5 meter, that's maybe already happening, because I don't think in the Kenai Peninsula 1.5 meter will freeze completely during the winter. So it's already actually thallic forming there.
Yeah, and I think Ben's work has already showed that really it doesn't freeze below 40 centimeters. So.
Right. In this case, you have different system. You have also, well, not frozen, of course, still cold. It's about 0 during the winter, but at least you have pretty much almost all water is not frozen in this layer, and microbes continue to decompose stuff, and so I think that that one eventually you will have to take into consideration this type of degradation of permafrost, and because it will be more and more common.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll get back up there soon and take some more cores from the plateau.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Vladimir. Hey, hi, Miriam. This is Ben.
Hey, Ben.
Hey, can I ask a quick question about, now that you're on this slide right here, just about mapping and scaling? Do you know of any adequate remote sensing products or maps available that you can use to try to scale your observations like more regionally or across the whole state of Alaska, or say North America, that would capture these relevant landscape features?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know of anything. I think what we were aiming to do with that 2012 paper with like these different age thaw features or drainage features of thermokarst lakes on the northern Seward Peninsula, we were trying to figure that out. So I think you worked on this, so you should know. Looking at if there's a way to categorize based on the vegetation inside of those features to kind of guess their age and how much carbon they have. I think that's one way of going about it, but I don't think there are actually any products that I know of.
Yeah, like go back maybe two slides from this one. Yeah, this slide, yeah. So I guess some kind of mapping product that could capture more or less this scale, but along like regional spatial scales.
Yeah, it seems like it should be able to be done, because I mean, I think these different colors that are represented here, especially in the Sunoco picture, kind of represent different aged features and different processes that are happening. So. Yeah,
that's cool. So are the brighter greens there on the lower right figure, are those the fens, or are those like recent collapsed scarp bogs?
I think that's a good question. I think the brighter green are more recently thawed features, and the darker are the older features. Okay. The black is open water, and then the sort of more rough color, white with green, is obviously the permafrost plateaus. So.
Hey Ben, this is Sarah, and You and Miriam wrote up this question, we have Christine Matai on the phone from NASA, and I think it's a good question to throw at NASA, and see what kind of response comes back. They've got an IARPIC team that meets regularly, not regularly, every 8 weeks, Christine, something like that. And it is something we could ask them.
Okay, that's a great idea, Sarah. Yeah, I've heard loosely from a couple folks that are involved with NASA above that they're working on producing a seamless mosaic of Alaska using worldview like 2 and 3 multispectral imagery. So you'd have basically 2-meter resolution imagery that's all spectrally consistent. So I think, yeah, if we could kind of pitch the question to those guys, it might they might be interested to know that we're interested in doing something like that.
Yeah, this is a lot of conversations I've had too. One angle on it is that down the road, what you really want is a unified ecotype map, it is scale appropriate for doing that sort of thing. And a lot of this is sort of a big undertaking to really do a good job of it so that everyone's happy with what they're doing and they trust the data. And yeah, that sounds totally appropriate to get NASA involved and pose the question that way.
Yeah, so Ben and whoever, if you could write up the question, then I can work with Christine and we can draw Eric Kozicki into this conversation.
Okay, that sounds great, Sarah. Thanks.
Thanks.
Well, we should probably do at this point. Actually, I wish we could just keep talking about this all day. It's fascinating stuff. Thanks again, Miriam, for presenting this. But we try and be pretty good about wrapping the webinar on time and not spilling way over.